All right, welcome back everybody to the final day of chapter 21. Yes, we only got one chapter left after this one, and we really only have about a week and a half left of school that we will be getting new assignments. So, school year is coming down to an end. So we left off with this slide right here, and we talked about how Richard Nixon won the 1968 election and how we were just starting to begin the Paris peace talks. So once elected as president, Richard Nixon adopted a policy of Vietnamization of the war, or in other words, he's going to remove the U.S. forces and replace them with South Vietnam soldiers, and American soldiers will slowly begin to return home after 1968. And the key word there is slowly. But still, privately hoping for a victory as peace negotiations continue. In Paris, Nixon will secretly resume bombing raids in North Vietnam and neighboring Cambodia, which is a neutral nation. And so he's gonna be doing some very like secret kind of shady stuff here. And well, once we get to chapter 22, you'll realize it's not the only shady stuff he's really doing. But yeah, he's gonna secretly bomb a neutral nation as well as northern Vietnam. The whole reason he's bombing Cambodia is because the Ho Chi Minh Trail runs through a section of that. So when Nixon was forced to publicly announce a U.S. strike into Cambodia to cut enemy supply lines and improve U.S. position in the Paris peace talks, chaos and violence will break out in Cambodia and in the United States. So in 1970, anti-war protests were turned violent in response to Nixon's expansion of the war. Kent State University in Ohio, students will riot in the streets and burn the ROTC buildings on campus. ROTC is Reserve Officer Training Corps. It's a way for you to basically go to college for free. When you're done, you become a second lieutenant in the Army, and then you also serve several years. I believe it's 4 years in the military as well. National Guard troops will then be sent in to maintain order and control of these protesters. But after being hit by rocks thrown by a small group of students, National Guard troops will actually open fire on that group of students. And when the chaos ends, four students will be dead and nine others wounded, but only two of those students affected were protesters. And so similar violence will occur at Jackson State, which is an all-black university in Mississippi as well. It's just not as well known as the Kent State shooting. So, the invasion in America, sorry, the division in America will still run deep as 100,000 construction workers in New York City will march in defense of President Nixon and our government's policies. So, we have students protesting the whole thing going on in Vietnam, and then we have 100,000 construction workers march through New York City in support of the war and Richard Nixon. And in 1971, we'll have the 26th Amendment, which is ratified giving 18-year-olds the right to vote. And young Americans will finally have the opportunity to influence the policies of their government. So, the whole point of the 26th Amendment was we are sending 18-year-olds off to fight in Vietnam, and these 18-year-olds can't even vote. Um, so, the 26th Amendment was passed, allowing giving 18-year-olds the right to vote, and previously the voting age was 21. And so by 1972, which is an election year, the war and negotiations will still be dragging on. So we've been at the negotiating table for 4 years now. In March, the North Vietnamese will launch a major offensive into the south, and Nixon will increase the bombing and mining of harbors in North Vietnam. Sorry. Ugh. In November, Nixon's surprise announcement that a peace settlement was near will win him re-election in a very, very close race. So Nixon's very close to losing the 1972 election. Um, And right before the election, he's going to announce that, hey, guess what? We have a deal. We've found a peace settlement. Because of this, he will basically win the election. So in this deal, oh well, and by win the election, he won in one of the largest electoral college um, victories of all time. Yeah, so what was a close election turned out very highly in Nixon's favor after that announcement, as you guys can tell by the slide. So in January of 1973, the United States and the governments of North and South Vietnam will sign a formal peace treaty due to the efforts of Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. Kissinger is a brilliant, brilliant diplomat. The U.S. would agree to withdraw all forces within 60 days of signing this peace treaty. All POWs on both sides would be released, and all parties would end the fighting in Laos and Cambodia. And 17th parallel would once again divide North and South Vietnam until the country could be united, but American involvement was at an end. So basically, everything's going back to how it was, and the U.S. is just going to get out. And in January of 1973, the U.S. participation and public opposition to the war will end. So as the war ends, so does our public opposition, and the country is going to start uniting a little bit more for a bit. Um, and fighting will continue between North and South Vietnam for 2 more years. And as South Vietnamese soldiers steadily lost ground to the North Vietnamese, um, things are going to get worse and worse for the fighting. On April 29th, 1975, the United States will evacuate 1,000 Americans and 6,000 Vietnamese from the capital city of Saigon as enemy forces closed in. On April 30th, 1975, oh, sorry guys, the war in Vietnam ended with a communist victory that reunited the nation. So on April 30th, 1975, the Vietnam War is officially over. No more fighting, and the communist forces of North Vietnam have won. And so this is a pretty famous picture. This is picture is the last helicopter out of Saigon. So that helicopter is parked on top of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, and it's the very last one that is going to leave. So if you're not on that helicopter, you're getting left behind. And so this is a picture on one of the aircraft carriers just off the coast of Vietnam. And the reason why they're pushing these helicopters off is they're trying to make more room for people on the ships. And the legacy of Vietnam is the longest and least successful war in history. And it's actually no longer the longest, so I do need to change that. The war in Afghanistan is now the longest war we have been in. But 58,000 Americans died and 300,000 were wounded. The $150 billion in direct expenses led to a huge national debt and growing inflation. And Vietnam was devastated, and civilians and military casualties were in the millions on the side of Vietnam. And though the domino theory predicted the collapse of all of Southeast Asia, only Laos and Cambodia will fall along with Vietnam through communism. Um, and so in Cambodia, the people had been victims of a genocide by 1975. So there will be a genocide that takes place in Cambodia. U.S. bombs had caused 500,000 deaths over 5 years of fighting just in Cambodia. And in 1975, the Khmer Rouge, which is a communist force led by Pol Pot, will exterminate 1.5 million Cambodians that are all associated with Western ways. Um, and that's roughly about a quarter of the population of that country was killed off by Pol Pot. Um, and so basically, the Western ways, if you were educated, um, in some, if basically if you were educated, he had you killed. If you're a lawyer, a teacher, doctor, or educated person in general, he had you killed. And he was in, it's not great. They had this thing called the Cambodian killing fields, where basically they turned this school into a prison where they would hold you there, torture you to find out where these other intellectuals were, and then they'd take you out in these fields, line you up, and just shoot you. And so he's a very, very terrible, terrible person. And under the communist government of Vietnam, hundreds and thousands were forced into re-education camps to be trained in communist ways. And 1.5 million Vietnamese boat people will flee to our country and were joined by refugees from Laos and Cambodia. And so the post-war United States was left with a splintered foreign policy, and we were forced to reassess America's global mission at this point. We realized the U.S. could no longer defend the world from communism around, around the entire world alone, as we had done since World War II and the start of the Cold War. US technology and money could not always guarantee our victory, and in November of 1973, Congress will pass the War Powers Act to establish congressional control over our nation's combat actions. And Nixon will veto this, but Congress will override that veto. And so, though the president had the power to send U.S. troops into foreign nations, he must now explain to Congress as to why within 48 hours. And after 60 days, Congress has the power to pull those troops from any conflict. So that's the War Powers Act. Super important you guys know that one. And the veterans of Vietnam will return home to less than a hero's welcome, isolated and carrying emotional scars that would last a lifetime. In 1974, President Ford offered draft evaders a conditional pardon, but was largely refused by those who had fled the draft and were still living in other countries. In 1977, President Carter granted a blanket pardon to all draft evaders who could now return to the U.S. without penalty. But it wasn't until 1982 and the completion of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial that was built to recognize the sacrifice of our soldiers that was truly a healing of our nation's wounds. And so here's an aerial view of the Vietnam War. It's kind of in an isolated section of all the monuments. If you go there, I highly, highly recommend doing it. These three soldiers kind of stand guard over the Vietnam War Memorial. And so all those names listed are all soldiers that died in Vietnam. And it's really kind of an emotional thing to go through and just see all these names of people. And in 1994, the U.S. Will announce the resumption of trade with Vietnam. And in 1995, the U.S. will formally restore diplomatic relations with its former enemy. And the war will finally be over. So that's it. Make sure you do the Google form attached to this. And I will have the study guide posted for tomorrow as well, so check my website for that.